When a California refinery stops producing fuel, most households do not see the shutdown itself. They see the price at the pump. They see the cost of a weekly commute. They see gasoline taking more space in a budget already crowded by groceries, rent, utilities, insurance, and other basic costs. Valero's Benicia refinery matters beyond the company that owns it because the shutdown affects more than one industrial site. The issue is not only that one refinery stopped producing fuels. The issue is what happens when a major source of local fuel production leaves a region where gasoline is already expensive, replacement supply is more complicated, and the fuel system has less room for error. On April 30, 2026, Argus reported that Valero had stopped producing fuels at its Benicia refinery in the San Francisco Bay Area. Argus described the refinery as a 145,000 barrel per day facility. Valero said it had ceased operation of the fuel production units after idling processing units in phases during the first 3 months of 2026 for the company. That was an operational decision. For Northern California, it meant a major local refinery was no longer producing fuels. For drivers, the issue is the supply cushion behind the pump price. A refinery turns crude oil into usable fuels. When a refinery stops producing, the local market loses a source of gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and other refined products. That does not mean fuel disappears immediately. It means the region must depend more on replacement supply, imports, inventories, and other refineries that may be farther away or less directly connected. That matters in California because the state's fuel market is difficult to backfill. EIA reported that California usually has higher retail gasoline prices than the national average, partly because the West Coast has relatively limited logistical connectivity to other U.S. refinery hubs, such as the Gulf Coast. EIA also said the supply shortfall left by the Los Angeles and Benicia refinery exits is likely to have an outsized impact because it cannot be easily filled by other refineries elsewhere in the country. The chain is straightforward. A refinery stops producing fuel. Local refining capacity falls. Replacement supply becomes more important. Imports and logistics carry more weight. The region has less flexibility. Price volatility can increase. Drivers are left more exposed to higher pump prices. The warning was already in the data before the shutdown was complete. On July 9, 2025, EIA reported that California was set to lose 17% of its oil refinery capacity over the next 12 months because of 2 planned refinery closures. Phillips, 66's Wilmington refinery in the Los Angeles area and Valero's Benicia refinery in the Bay Area. EIA listed the Wilmington refinery at 139,000 barrels per day and the Benicia refinery at 145,000 barrels per day. Nationally, the 2 refineries accounted for less than 2% of current U.S. refining capacity. Regionally, the picture was very different. EIA said the 2 facilities represented 17% of California refinery capacity and 11% of West Coast, or PADD5, capacity. That contrast is central to the story. A closure can look small on a national map and still be large in the market where people actually buy fuel. California drivers do not pay the national refinery capacity average. They pay prices shaped by California's local refineries, regional fuel rules, import routes, inventories, and distribution system. EI also wrote that, if the closures were realized, they were likely to contribute to increased fuel price volatility on the West Coast. That is not a claim that every price increase comes from one refinery. It is a more precise warning. When a region loses a large share of local capacity and replacement supply is harder to source, the fuel market becomes more vulnerable. For a household, volatility means less predictability. A family can budget for fuel when prices are stable. It becomes harder when gasoline jumps quickly, especially in a state where prices are already high. Contra Costa News reported on May 8, 2026, citing AAA that California's average regular gasoline price rose 15 cents in 1 week to $6.16 per gallon. That was $1.82 higher than the same time the previous year. That price context matters because the Benicia shutdown did not happen in a low-cost market. It happened in a state where drivers were already paying some of the highest gasoline prices in the country. The verified claim is not that Benicia alone caused California gas prices to reach that level. The verified claim is that Benicia stopped producing fuel in a market already marked by high prices, specialized fuel requirements, limited logistical connections, rising import dependence, and EIA's warning about increased price volatility. The decision began a year earlier. On April 16, 2025, Valero announced that its subsidiary, Valero Refining Company California, had submitted notice to the California Energy Commission of its intent to idle, restructure, or cease refining operations at the Benicia refinery by the end of April 2026. Valero CEO Lane Riggs said, "We understand the impact that this may have on our employees, business partners, and community, and will continue to work with them through this period." The quote matters because the impact was not limited to fuel markets. It reached workers, business partners, and the local community tied to the refinery. Valero also said it recorded a combined pre-tax impairment charge of $1.1 billion for the Benicia and Wilmington refineries, Included in that amount was the recognition of expected asset retirement obligations of $337 million as of March 31, 2025. Those are company accounting figures, but they also show the scale of the transition. This was a major change involving refinery assets, retirement obligations, employment, supply planning, and local economic consequences. By January 2026, Valero's own update said it would proceed with idling refining operations through a phased approach, starting with processing units in February. The company said the refinery would continue producing gasoline as it worked down inventories but expected most refining process units to be idled by April. The shutdown did not happen in one step. It moved through phases. The refinery continued producing gasoline while working down inventories, then moved toward idling most refining process units by April. By April 30th, Argus reported that fuel production had stopped. That sequence shows how an industrial decision becomes a supply event. First, notice is filed, then the company plans idling. Processing units begin shutting down. Inventories are worked down, fuel production stops. The local market then relies more heavily on imports and replacement supply. The effect is not only about gasoline. Valero's facility page lists the Benicia refinery at 170,000 barrels per day of throughput capacity, while Argus and EIA describe it as 145,000 barrels per day in the closure context. Those figures come from different source definitions and should not be mixed. Both show that Benicia was a major facility. Valero says the Benicia refinery produced carbob gasoline, diesel, carb diesel, jet fuel, and asphalt. It also says Benicia accounted for 10% of CARB gasoline used in California and 25% of CARB gasoline used in the San Francisco Bay Area. Valero also says Benicia accounted for 45% of asphalt supply in Northern California. Those details broaden the economic impact. Gasoline affects drivers directly. Diesel affects freight and the movement of goods. Jet fuel connects to aviation. Asphalt connects to roads and construction. A refinery shutdown is not only about one product at one gas station. It can touch several parts of a regional economy. For middle-class households, the most visible impact is still the pump. A driver may not know whether fuel came from Benicia, another California refinery, a shipment from Asia, or another replacement source. The driver knows when a tank costs more. The driver knows when a commute becomes harder to absorb. The driver knows when transportation leaves less room for other bills. That is why local refining capacity matters. EIA identified likely replacement fuels as imports from Asia, especially jet fuel and gasoline. EIA also noted that California's unique gasoline blend stock, carbob, can only be made by properly equipped refineries. Fuel is not always interchangeable. California's fuel system has specific requirements, but replacement supply depends on properly equipped refineries and longer import routes. The system becomes more complicated than simply replacing one barrel with another from anywhere in the country. Valero said in its January 2026 update that it remained committed to fulfilling contractual supply obligations in the California market and anticipated importing additional gasoline volumes to the Bay Area in the near term. That provides important balance. The verified story is not that fuel disappears. Valero said it planned to fulfill obligations and import additional gasoline volumes. The verified story is that local production capacity falls, replacement supply becomes more important, and the region becomes more exposed to the logistics and price dynamics of outside supply. Argus reported that refined product imports into the western U.S. rose to nearly 345,000 barrels per day from January 1 to April 10, 2026, up 38% from the same period the prior year. Argus also reported that California gasoline imports rose to 122,000 barrels per day in February as the Benicia plant started to shut down, up from 28,000 barrels per day in January. Those import figures show the transition already underway. As local refining capacity moved lower, replacement supply became more important. For consumers, that means the fuel system depends more on shipping, timing, specialized supply, and global logistics. Those factors are often invisible to drivers, but they help shape the market behind the pump price. The local employment impact was also significant. Valero's facility page says the Benicia refinery had more than 400 employees. The San Francisco Chronicle reported in January 2026 that Valero expected to lay off 237 of 348 employees at the Benicia refinery between March 15 and July 1, 2026, as the company moved forward with permanently idling refinery processing units. That is the second path of economic consequence. One path runs through fuel supply and pump prices. The other runs through jobs, local spending, city revenue, and the business network around the refinery. The San Francisco Chronicle also reported that Benicia officials warned of major local fiscal impact, with city manager Mario Giuliani saying the city would need to cut roughly $7.7 million from its budget after the refinery closure. For a city, a refinery can be more than a fuel facility. It can be a major employer, a taxpayer, a purchaser of local services, and a central part of the local economic base. For households in the region, the closure can be felt in more than one way. Some households may feel it through employment, others may feel it through city finances, many more may feel it through fuel costs and the broader supply system. The pattern becomes clearer when the timeline is stacked. In April 2025, Valero gave notice to the California Energy Commission that it intended to idle, restructure, or cease refining operations at Benicia by the end of April 2026. In July 2025, EIA warned that California was set to lose 17% of its oil refinery capacity over the next 12 months because of the Benicia and Phillips 66 Wilmington closures. EIA said the closures were likely to contribute to fuel price volatility on the West Coast if realized. In January 2026, Valero said it would proceed with phased idling starting with processing units in February. The company said the refinery would continue producing gasoline while working down inventories and expected most refining process units to be idled by April. That same month, the San Francisco Chronicle reported expected layoffs of 237 of 348 employees between March 15 and July 1, 2026. In February, Argus reported that California gasoline imports rose to 122,000 barrels per day as the Benicia plant started to shut down, up from 28,000 barrels per day in January. From January 1 to April 10, Argus reported Western U.S. refined product imports at nearly 345,000 barrels per day, up 38% from the same period a year earlier. On April 30, Argus reported that Valero had stopped producing fuels at the 145,000 barrel per day Benicia refinery. On May 8, Contra Costa News reported, citing AIA, that California gasoline averaged $6.16 per gallon, up 15 cents in 1 week, and $1.82 higher year over year. This is not a single headline. It is a sequence. Notice, warning, phased idling, layoffs, rising imports, stopped fuel production, elevated gasoline prices. Each step affects a different part of the economy. The notice affects workers and public agencies. The EIA warning affects how the market understands regional supply risk. The phased idling affects refinery output. The layoffs affect employees and the local economy. The import increase affects replacement supply. The end of fuel production affects the regional supply cushion. Elevated gasoline prices affect drivers and household budgets. That is the cause and effect story. The closure itself is not the only event. It is one part of a larger pattern of California losing refining capacity. EIA paired Benicia with the Phillips 66 Wilmington refinery in its 17% capacity loss analysis. Wilmington was listed at 139,000 barrels per day, while Benicia was listed at 145,000 barrels per day. Together, EIA said they represented 17% of California refining capacity and 11% of West Coast capacity. A national observer might focus on the fact that the two refineries account for less than 2% of current U.S. refining capacity. The consumer impact is regional. A California driver does not experience U.S. refining capacity evenly. The driver experiences the California fuel market. That market has its own prices, fuel specifications, supply routes, and exposure to import dependence. That is why a closure can matter more in California than the national percentage suggests. EIA said the supply shortfall cannot be easily filled by other refineries elsewhere in the country because of limited West Coast connectivity to other U.S. refinery hubs. The region has fewer simple options when local capacity leaves. For consumers, fewer options can mean less stability. This does not mean immediate shortage. It means the market has less local production and more dependence on replacement supply. In a market where gasoline was already above $6 per gallon in May 2026 reporting that reduced cushion matters, the household impact is direct. A family paying $6.16 per gallon is not thinking about refinery throughput definitions. It is thinking about the cost of getting to work, driving children to school, buying groceries, and managing the week. A commuter does not control California's import routes. A parent does not control whether carbob can be made by a properly equipped refinery. A small business owner does not control whether regional refining capacity falls by 17%. They can still face the cost when the fuel system becomes more fragile. The company is not the protagonist. Valero made the decision. EIA measured the regional risk. Argus reported the end of fuel production. AAA data showed California gasoline prices. The story lands on drivers, workers, local budgets, and households. The contrasting positions should stay clear. EIA's position was that the closures would reduce California refining capacity and likely contribute to increased fuel price volatility on the West Coast if realized. EIA also said the supply shortfall would likely have an outsized impact because it could not be easily filled by other U.S. refineries. Valero's position was that it remained committed to fulfilling contractual supply obligations in the California market and anticipated importing additional gasoline volumes to the Bay Area in the near term. Both can be true. A company can plan to fulfill supply obligations and import more fuel, while the region still loses local refining capacity and becomes more exposed to volatility. The script should not claim that Benicia alone caused California's high gasoline prices. The research does not prove that. The accurate conclusion is that Benicia's shutdown removed local refinery capacity in a market already characterized by high prices, specialized fuel requirements, limited logistics, and increased import dependence. That explains why ordinary people should care about a refinery many may never see. The current status is clear from the verified record. As of April 30, 2026, Valero had stopped producing fuels at the Benicia refinery. The company said fuel production units had ceased operation after phased idling during the first 3 months of 2026. Valero's January update said it expected most refining process units to be idled by April and anticipated importing additional gasoline volumes to the Bay Area in the near term. EIA's regional analysis said California was set to lose 17% of its refining capacity because of Benicia and Phillips 66 Wilmington, and that the closures were likely to contribute to fuel price volatility on the West Coast if realized. California gasoline prices remained elevated in May 2026 reporting, with Contra Costa News citing AAA at $6.16 per gallon on May 8, up 15 cents in 1 week and $1.82 higher year over year. The unresolved pressure is the smaller fuel cushion left behind. Benicia was a source of carbob gasoline, diesel, carb diesel, jet fuel, and asphalt. It accounted for 10% of CARB gasoline used in California and 25% used in the San Francisco Bay Area. It accounted for 45% of asphalt supply in Northern California. It employed more than 400 people, and reported layoffs affected 237 of 348 employees. When that kind of facility stops producing fuels, the impact is not confined to one company. It can move through fuel supply, imports, employment, city finances, pump prices, freight, construction materials, and the household budget. For drivers, the result may appear as a higher gasoline price. For workers, it may appear as job uncertainty. For the city, it may appear as a budget gap. For households, it may appear as less flexibility in a month already filled with fixed costs. That is the economic consequence. Valero's Benicia shutdown is not only an industrial story, it is a story about what happens when a regional fuel system loses part of its local production base. The refinery stops producing. Local capacity shrinks. Imports become more important. Price volatility becomes a larger concern. Workers and local budgets face pressure. Drivers continue paying for fuel in one of the most expensive gasoline markets in the country. That is why the shutdown matters, not because the refinery is the main character, but because its absence can travel through the economy until it reaches people who never saw the refinery operate, never followed the company announcement, and still have to pay for the fuel that moves their lives.